moving across the board. Well, good afternoon, morning, evening, whatever it is for those who are tuning in for another conversation about the work of evangelists. We've got Jared Saltz joining us for this conversation today as we take some time to discuss and investigate some basic processes that he and I use for our different types of work. We're going to be looking into very specifically the methods that he and I each use to develop our teaching material, whether it's for a Bible class, for a private study, in his case for academic studies at the college where he teaches, some of the background for some of that. And in each of these steps, if you will, we're trying our very best to explain why we've made these choices. Jared, how you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. I was just making sure that I've got it up on my Facebook link over here so I can see what's happening at the same time. But yeah, classes are open for me. I've got my grades in. I am doing fantastic.
Yeah, that's like the nice bonus part. Everyone, thinks about kids being excited for the end of a semester for a break, but the students who are part of it, they really, really forget that teachers probably long for those breaks more than they do. I think all your grading is
There's
done,
no,
right?
yeah, my grading is done. My grades are submitted. I told my students the last week of class, said, look, as tired as you are of seeing me, I am far more tired of seeing you. I was talking to a different professor, and
Yeah.
they said, I love my students, but I don't want to see their work anymore. I said, I will love my students again in January. So the breaks are good for us
Yeah.
all.
One quick note, Terry can't be with us for the broadcast today. He's got some family scheduling things he's working out, and so hopefully he'll be back in our regular slot next week. So Jared, let's get right to the heart of the matter. We've kind of broken it down, at least for our purposes, to keep us on track and not get too sidetracked, too off kilter there. We've got three areas: preparation, planning, and people. And so obviously we're going to start with our preparation side and do a little look into starting with research. We've got three categories, that we've kind of broken each of these sections down into a little bit more detailed. But for me, one of the first things that I do, since I've taught the classes before, and by the way, we're using two things as a structure to talk about the process. First thing is we're talking about teaching Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And we've got a little Twitter thread that I'll link to in a second. That's a great resource to understand another person's process about this. That's kind of giving us a focus point to talk about this. But the principles we're talking about, for me at least, are consistent no matter what I'm going to teach, no matter what I'm going to study. But we're just using this one because we just happen to be kind of on the same schedule teaching these books by happenstance. So for me, first thing I do is get out my old outlines. What did I do before? And I keep notes on those outlines. Those notes are like, this didn't work. Someone asked this question. I didn't have an answer to this. This was a surprise. Someone brought this stuff up. What about you?
When I was setting up, when I first moved down to Florida College, I started preaching at Palmetto, and so I got dumped into the last half of the Judges class. And so in this case, when I was first developing it, I'd never taught Judges before. I'd read it, I'd studied it. And so I was kind of creating that first through in terms of notes. For me, my first through is I'm reading through the text. A lot of times I'm taking notes on what connections do I see? What stories do these connect to? What are the major questions? Kind of put together a rough outline. And then I have some sort of a basis of that kind of a text like you're talking about, and I can start dumping other things in. But luckily now I've had the chance to teach a class on Judges Ruth here at Florida College 2 times in a row. And so second time around, I have those notes with the same sorts of questions, comments that you have. What worked? What didn't? What do I want to do differently this time? What holes that I realized that were there that I hadn't realized were there until I got to them when I was teaching and someone asked me a question? So generally those same sorts of things, and that's what I do for whatever course that I teach, whether that's in church or in the academy, is I try to figure out and anticipate what sorts of questions and concerns and where am I trying to lead people, and then start dumping things into the research from there.
Yeah. And for me, the structure I use, because I understand that even though I may have an outline that I'll eventually develop for both the schedule of the classes and the structure of the text, I tend to keep my research notes linked to the verses that are connected to it, because I'm often looking at small details in those research points, and so I'll have them kind of connected in Logos. For me, I use Logos right now as the center point for a lot of this information, and so I'll take them in there. I'll dump. This is the section for chapter 4, verses 10 and 11, and here's a great point or comment within it, and so I'll add those little things there, and then when I get ready to teach, all that's available to me, but I'll have an outline that's going to keep me on track. It's a schedule that I'm going to teach this much of this text for this session. And here are some of the key questions that I think are relevant or necessary to be answered right now. By the way, here's a question I think that a lot of folks get, and we'll kind of tie it into some of this. When you're trying to figure out the questions you're going to ask your audience, and we'll get to audience down the road, are there some tips that you've found that help you build good questions to ask people? I think great questions are a good teaching skill to build on the preparation side. For me, they come in like my little reflection period. But what are some perspective you have there?
Yeah, so one of the things that I try to do is for every class period, whether we're in church or in college or wherever else, I want to decide what is the main question that lies behind everything else in the text that we're talking about. And once you can kind of figure out what that question is, I want to be able to help people think through that. So what I'm doing throughout the class is kind of setting up various elements that is the background, is the building blocks they need to even answer that question, and then pose it then at the end, or sometimes I'll pose it at the end of class for what the question is for next time. I say, hey, I've got 3 questions for you, and they're really all the same question. What's this? What's this? What's that? And why, right? And so kind of putting those things together, that's something I got from Tom Hamilton. He one time would ask, for every class period, students had to come up with, what is the main question of this text? Like, what's it doing? And I think if you can find that and put that in first, everything else starts to fall in a little bit better.
For me, my questions tend to lend towards a mixture of insight about who God is, insight about who we are, and then an application point. Like, how am I going to make application of this biblical text today, tomorrow, in general? And so I'll try to pick things that fit one of those 3 models: who God is, whether it's Jehovah, whether it's Jesus, the Holy Spirit, all of those things. And Hal made a little great quick comment. I'll add this in. If our questions are too hyper specific, then we, at least from me, it creates a potential for information paralysis, where you're asking a question that's so narrowly lasered that unless the person really knows you, really knows the text, they may not get that hyper specific question. That's different from a hyper easy question, super easy question. Who are the people in the Bible?
Jesus.
Yeah. So if we can kind of understand the difference between a really easy question that everyone should get, but one that's so specific and narrowly focused that no one will get, only because they can't determine what you're looking for. That's really a great questioning tool to kind of add in there. Let's shift a little bit kind of down the line in our process on the research side, because we talk about the research side. We've got our past stuff, like where we learned, what we did before. That lends me to figure out, what do I need to know to answer these questions? So on my next step is usually reading and listening. For me, I've got a series of commentaries that I've read. If folks want to know what Jared and I have read, we can answer those questions for these books particularly. So I read commentaries, I read articles. Lately, over the last year, I've been making it a very specific point to listen to each of these sections of the book that I'm teaching read to me multiple times before I get up to teach. For me, there's 2 reasons I do that. One, It helps with pronunciation. It gives me at least a baseline that someone said pronounce it this way. But secondly, it brings the text to me in a new way that maybe I'm not as accustomed to, at a different pacing. And I found that it's really helped me with retention. Like, I remember stuff better having it read to me than when I just read it or I just survey it, in the different points of the week. What about you?
I think you make a really good point about listening to an audio version. I mean, the Bible was originally written to be heard, not to be read. I mean, until the fourth century, no one even personally, when they're just sitting alone, right, they still read aloud, which seems crazy to us. But how often in the Bible do we read about these great religious reforms occurring because of the public reading of Scripture? And so often those things do really need to cue our ears, and it helps us slow down. Most of us read much faster when we're reading silently than when we're reading aloud. And anything that can help you slow down is a wonderful, wonderful thing. One thing that I'm, able to do to help me in that process is I read through it again in Hebrew ahead of time, and that helps me catch some things that I'm just so used to bulleting through in English. So I do the same thing. I listen, I read it in multiple versions, right? That's, about as good as it is for a lot of us. And then I try to, every time I teach something again, read one or two new things. Excel still more, right? Grow my knowledge, grow my wisdom, and make sure that I'm not just said, you know what, I figured out everything there is to know about this. I'm done. I don't need to do any more work. We never get to that point. No matter how much we know, there's always more to learn. And I think that's a good way to help myself continue to excel still more on there.
Yeah. And I think, when I say reading another thing, it kind of depends on time. I may not have the time because of the scope of the subject. Now, with Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, I've known that I'm teaching those well in advance. And so I can read an entire commentary, if need be, in advance of the next time I teach it. But even if it's just a short article, an academic piece, like I've linked in the comments already, a really great Twitter thread by the warden of Tyndale House,
Dr. Peter Williams.
Dr. Peter Williams. He talks about the way in which Ruth fits together with, in this case, Judges, and how it kind of literary plays take place between the closing appendixes of Judges, as he describes them, and the text of Ruth, and some of the interwoven principles that are there. You do see a lot of that, playing out and taking place, and those are great resources because it may spark you to ask a good question internally that you can then explain to others externally. Like you can say, "Oh, I didn't know that. This is what that thing is. Now, okay, what do I do with it? How do I break it down? How do I share it?" And so I'd encourage people to kind of reach out a little bit outside their, all right, I've already read this thing, comfort zone, and read a new thing. So that takes place next for me. The next thing that takes place, at least in my thing, is I start actually categorizing of all the information I've gained, what are the best parts? Whether it's from prior research, prior study, prior look into things, or this new book. This is the best new book. It's the end of the year, so everyone's putting out these lists of, this is the best new book you've read in 2019 or whatever. I kind of do that for every Bible class. What are the best new things that I think are important? For me this year, it's been a whole lot of geography, a whole lot of where, what, and when kind of stuff. And there's obvious reasons for why geography is really cool to me right now. But that tends to be like where I lean in that regard with some of that. What about you? What's your next step after you've done your reading?
So
how do you describe or process it?
Yeah, so one of the things that I try to do, and this kind of connects these two ideas, is I try to say, where am I weakest on this topic, right? Maybe it's like you said, if you're really into geography and that's kind of where you're strong, we always want to kind of play to the strengths, and I think that's good. At the same time, I want to say, is there a place that I'm weaker that I really need to shore up on here, and I might hit that up. But a lot of it's driven by kind of what I see is kind of this spiral of the way we put together and think about classes. It's that I have an idea of what I want to accomplish, and then I work backwards. But then after I've read and thought about it and listened and considered and all these different things, I had to kind of recalibrate and said, okay, now what do I want to change about what I want to do about this? Right? Now, how is that going to guide what I'm going to do next? How do I want to structure this class? How many class periods am I going to need? Am I in a quarter system? Am I in a semester system? A trimester system? This kind of bleeds into the people aspect. But how do I want to accomplish what I want to accomplish for whom I am teaching? And all those things kind of come together.
Right. And so, we've kind of intentionally laid this out. So we shift from preparation to planning. I want to put something out. A lot of guys, particularly in their preaching, they will either script their message perfectly great to have a full scripted version of your lesson. That means every word planned out. Some guys will pre-preach a lesson especially when they're beginning to preach. They'll get up in an empty room and present the message with nobody out there. Teaching doesn't always have that ability to do. We're talking more about teaching than preaching right now. And so for the weight of your effort, a lot of that preparation has to then be accessible. Like you've got to be able to access it because there's a limit to what you can quickly recall in a conversation, in a class, in a study, in those settings. And so I try to then synthesize all of that stuff in preparation down to the best, again, those high points that will either kick my memory into gear, like here's that thing, or at least it was so relevant that I want it to be a very specific statement, but I've got it keyed out there. And that happens in the reflection phase of the process where I'll sit there and hand write out a couple of things and lay them out as plainly as possible in that process. But then I have to start making some plans like we talked about and figuring out what's next. In your case, you tend to kind of live in two different buckets most often, which is an academic schedule, which has its own levels of flexibility and inflexibility, and then a congregational context. For me, it's congregational context and a whole lot of home private one-on-one studies. So how do you set up your pacing for that? Like, how do you figure out how much you're going to cover each session? Like, is there a method you're using? Is it 17 verses per class as a silly illustration, or what's going on there in the process?
So that's a great question, and it's different. So I kind of am cursed and am lucky to teach very different sorts of courses. On the one hand, I teach enormous courses, right? So one class I just taught this past semester was Survey of the Old Testament Prophets, which is, a massive amount of material, and it's a 1-hour class that meets twice a week for 50 minutes. And so I had 3 classes on Isaiah, right? 3 classes on Jeremiah, 1 class each on most of the minor prophets. And so at that point, it's like, well, that's what we have to do because we've got to get through this material. But on the other hand, and that has its pluses and minuses, but on the other hand, we get to church and, some of you guys are on trimester or semester, however those schedules work. Where I'm at, we actually do not have a schedule, which drives the type A person in me just bonkers, right? I'm like, I need to know how long I've got. And it's, well, however long it takes to cover it. But that's a black hole, right? Because, I think all of us have probably been in those 6-year-long studies on the book of Acts, right? You don't know where you started when you get to the end. And so when we get to that point, I try to be very, very thoughtful ahead of time and say, how long is reasonable for my group at their level and what they know about this topic to cover it without spending forever there. Then I actually put together for myself a syllabus of sorts. Now it's a little bit looser than it is in an academic setting. So for example, Sunday morning I was like, we're going to get through chapters 1 Kings chapters 18 and 19, which is like this really important section with the Elijah and the prophets of Baal and Mount Carmel and then going up to Mount Sinai. And I kind of knew in the back of my head, we're only going to make it through 18. People are going to want to talk about it. And they did, and that was fine. But I had that flexibility in there that I said, okay, I knew we're going to happen, and we're just going to move on. But at the same time, we covered the entire temple sequence, 3-4 chapters in a single day. So it kind of depends on what we're doing and what I think the group needs, how I structure that out. But it's structured ahead of time. And I think that is very, very useful, that you don't just go, well, we're going to go until we finish, or we're going to go 17 verses and we're stop. There's probably something in between there for flexibility, but also
Like
structure.
for me, like what I've done, we took 2 years to cover the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Partially intentional, take that much time, um, and partially reflective of side tracks that had to take place because of deeper dives into certain new sections of the text that people had never really read carefully before. They've read them before. Another reason for that is you get interruptions for gospel meetings, interruptions for visiting speakers. And so that slows it down a little bit. And each of those steps require you to stop the teaching, catch the teaching back up. And so there's a little bit of that takes place. A little slower than I personally wanted it to go. That's okay. We were teaching at a certain level, and they're also at that point in time learning how I teach things. And so that's a part of a learning process too. They're getting to know me at a congregational level versus coming in for a weekend study, a week-long study. I can do kind of things differently that way. And so as we step into Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, the pace will be quicker. And actually, when we get into the divided and the United Kingdoms, the pace will be even quicker there, because there's reasons why we don't need to be bogging ourselves down in the interactions between Chronicles and whatever else we want to have on that table that day. So there'll be some pacing issues there. Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say one thing Bob brought up, that it's a really good question. It's like, how do you think about planning, working around the level of participation because we all know, right? Like sometimes you don't get any participation and you just fly through your material, and other times people really want to camp out on a subject. That's a great question. And that's something that, just as you said, Phillip, that your audience is getting used to you, you're going to get used to your audience. Now, we have all had the situation where a visitor's there and they just want to camp out on something. And there's not a lot you can do about that. But in general, I've found, where I've been teaching, I've been preaching, I've been there for 4 years now. And I know pretty well, the relationship between us is pretty good. And I know most of the time what they're going to want to talk about and how much they're going to want to talk about it. And they're going to know what I'm going to want to talk about and how much I'm going to want to talk about it. And we have a good give and take there, and I plan that into our discussions. Now, the first year I was there, I was not as good at that. And there are times, you hate to do it, but you got to say, look, we're going to circle back around to that, but we really need to get to this today. Maybe come talk to me afterwards, or say, you know what, if this is really important, I'll schedule a sermon on it, or we can get together, right? But I do think there is value in not losing the class for a particular single point. Now, at the same time, right, sometimes that point is worth it. So it's a balancing act, and a lot of it's going to depend on the relationship between you and the group. What about you?
And you're never going to be 100% happy with that process. Like you're going to be like, I really wanted to spend more on this because I think it's amazing, but then you realize you may think it's amazing, but there's not a great depth of value to your audience. And your audience could be, by the way, we'll talk about this in a second, auditorium class, college class, high school kids, one-on-one Bible study, some guy who wants to preach one day. And those are all different in massively different ways. And so they adjust how you're going to pace the class. I think Jared and I would probably agree about this specifically. If your approach is just to plow through the text verse by verse, that's going to be a struggle. It's going to be really hard on everybody, and that's how you end up with those 6-year-long studies on the book of Acts. Because then the minute you saying we're going to go verse to verse, then you're going to go word to word. And you're going to spend an entire class on one verse defining every single word in that, and actually teach basically nothing at that point, other than how to use a dictionary and Google.
Yeah, and even at that point, it tends to, and even at that point, it tends to use the wrong tools and focus on the wrong. At least in the memorable times I've been in such a study. So yeah, we definitely want to avoid that sort of a thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, a lot of that goes into, do you know your people? Do you know your audience?
Yeah, and that's something that's going to have a scale too, like how well you know them. Chris Emerson comments, great discussion, guys. I'm more secure now in the confidence that my purpose is to teach people the word and give them tools to apply it. It's not to answer all their questions or tell them things to do or not do. The day I stopped doing that was a good day. So, um, you know, that's an excellent kind of perspective point to add into this. You got to have purposes intentionally included in your planning phase. I've got it broken down for me. A couple of key things: pacing and then placement. How does it fit in with everything else I'm doing? Um, at Eastside, we try to have a good mix of things. My structure is very organized for 2020. I can kind of know what I'm going to be teaching from the pulpit, what I'm teaching in Bible classes, what our visitors might be teaching on. And so I keep that in mind. Jared has a point I want him to explain, talking about backwards design. So, Jared, what do you mean by that, and how do you apply it in the context of a Bible study, Bible class?
Yeah, so backwards design is one of these, fancy educational pedagogical terms that we say, ooh, that sounds great. What does it mean? Right? But really all it is understanding what do you want to accomplish and keep that forefront in your mind. There is a tendency for us to come in and say, okay, I'm going to teach, we'll use our book, right? I'm going to teach the book of Judges. And you're like, why? Well, it comes next. Or, well, I don't know, right? Well, what do you want the class to get out of it? Well, I want them to learn the Bible. Okay, great. But that's true of any book you teach. Why did you pick Judges? Right? What does that do for your audience? What do you want it to accomplish? What do you want them to take away at the end of what you're doing? And this is true not just of a big course, although I think it's more important at a big course, but it's also true at the smaller, more micro level of your sermon, right? Most of us, I think, probably say, I want my audience to get this out of the sermon. And now maybe this is something different. Maybe it's a point about our relationship with God. Maybe it is an understanding of grace or something of that nature. And the same thing, though, should be true of our classes. What do I want to accomplish? And now that you've got this big idea, you can break that down into the parts. Well, if I want all of this big idea to come, well, how am I building that up in each of the individual sessions that I'm teaching, right? So, for example, I'm teaching the book of Kings right now, and one of the things the main thing that I want my audience to get out of this is that the whole book of Kings is messianic in hope, in that it's showing there is no king like David and there's no prophet like Moses. And so every class is really built around that, and how I determine what I teach, right? Because you can't teach everything, is really based on, does it contribute to this overall idea? And that's related to what Benjamin Young asked, is balancing of this content and concepts. You will never get through all of the content, and you will never get all of the concepts. But having this in design, this backwards kind of looking at the end and coming backwards, can help answer some of those really nitty-gritty, sometimes better felt than told questions of what content do they need to know and what concepts do they need to know. How do you balance that? What do you think about those sorts of things?
Well, for me, and this is first something about Ben Young's question. We've got a couple other comments or questions we'll dig through next. As we were closing out Deuteronomy, I began to foreshadow the text of Joshua, Judges, and Ruth with variations of this story I'm about to tell. These three books are kind of like Israel takes a Studebaker, pushes it into the ravine, and that's Joshua. And then they go down to the Studebaker and they push it down into the water and the muck and the mire, so much so that you can't see it anymore. And now it's full of all the dead fishes that are in the Dead Sea. And so that's a version to think about Judges. That's what you get there. By the time Ruth comes, Mater comes with his tow truck, throws his line across over to the Studebaker, and pulls it up the other side of the ravine. It creates the structure to understand those three books. There's a bunch of different ways you can storytell that, but I foreshadowed our next three books in our next series of classes at the close of Deuteronomy, using that methodology, using that principle of saying, I'm going to tell you a story about the stories we're going to get. So that gives me some concept and content at the same time, because that's also how God teaches us. He tells us a story to do those things. Now, level of depth comes into play. The story I just told is really surface level. Like, it's there. It's actually kind of obvious the more you pay attention to it. but it doesn't actually tell much of anything on the reasons of the whys, of the whos, of the intricacies of the problems. And so you don't get any of that. So the balance comes from making some intentional consideration of asking these kind of questions. What is the spiritual and academic background of my audience? What do they know? And what do they bring to the table that I don't know? So that will influence the process I'm going to use to figure out how much depth I'm going to give them. Am I going to go into grammar? Am I going to go into language? Am I going to go into culture? Am I going to bring all of those three up? Am I going to bring none of them up? Because I don't need to, or if I do, we'll get too sidetracked. Those are issues that would kind of prep the things. Also, understand you. The very first adult level Bible study I taught as a full-time employed evangelist was Isaiah. I taught it as if I was pretending to be Melvin Curry. Nobody profited from that. I didn't. The brethren didn't. We did not finish that study because it was simply too much. I was way over their heads. They tried to keep up, but it was too much reading required of them. So you have to know where you're at. So teach to your strengths. If you're just starting to preach, you probably don't know what those are yet. So keep the old analogy from my football days in play. Keep it simple, stupid. That's when I was told that regularly. It was actually the basis for a lot of our plays we used. And make it simplified. As you build an individual human library of things you know, you'll be able to pack more meat on the frame you built the first time you taught it. That's just my answer to that specific, how do I get those and prepare to teach? Because if I do that, if I tell the story, when I tell the scripture story, the text itself should be apparent on the top layer of the lasagna.
Top layer of lasagna. I do like lasagna, so although I'm a little bit embarrassed you didn't go like the cheese on the taco or something, you're really kind of moving off your brand here. I don't know how we deal with that.
Well, I'm on brand regularly at Eastside, and so I've got to limit my taco references in all contexts, just because I don't want to overburden anyone with the glory that is the variety of the taco, the handheld delivery device of greatness. So we could go more in depth. If we want to wax poetic about tacos, we can.
But we'd have to do that at
Deep
Torchy's.
poetry.
It's always important to worship at the correct location. So
That-
if you just
that
taught
is
Deuteronomy,
correct.
you should
You know,
know
if you-
this.
I know the location matters. That possibly could happen. There's also extreme tacos nearby a place where you frequent regularly that we can go to and do some comparative analysis and constructive criticism.
I think scientific analysis is important there.
Yeah. So Mark Russell brings up something he's dealt with over the years, having his studies done too quickly or lingering too long, and kind of synthesizing the text into those things. That elasticity of stretch comes from me on the planning side. If I blaze through text too quickly based on my plan, I need to make sure I'm ready to teach the next class anyway. I typically prepare well in advance of teaching the class so that if I need to go to the next chunk, we just go to the next chunk. And then in the middle of the class next time, we'll pick up from there, and maybe that class will go slower. That's also why I make notes. I will brutally, honestly evaluate my performance the next day, the night of, whatever, and say, dummy head, you taught too fast. Don't be so foolish this time to think that these are the things you need to do. I'm the worst critic of myself, and so I will hash those things out. The next time I teach it, I'll teach it more effectively. I did like Chris's quick comment. I'm the one asking the questions here. So moving forward a little bit, we've got, and I'll get to Chris's last comment in a second. One of the things I want to make sure we touch on in the course of our discussion, at least two things that I have left, is we're talking about our audience in a second. We're also going to walk through this Twitter thread from Dr. Williams in a moment and kind of talk through it on a learning side as a closing thing. But audience really matters. For me, I listed at the last part of the step because you can kind of do the planning preparation side a bit independent of those things. But knowing the who, what, when, where, and why of your audience, of the people you're connecting with, helps you shift all of these questions. And I illustrate it this way. We studied Joshua 2 on our last Bible study, our adult study, and talking about Rahab the harlot, Rahab the whore, Rahab the prostitute. If you want to pick the least likely translation of the text, Rahab the innkeeper, that some people try to squeeze into that text there.
Oh, we do love doing that.
Because we really want her to be the champion of our VBS books. We want her to be morally pure before her conversion. But I pointed out, this is a struggle that everyone goes through, because how many times have you read through some of these sections of the text with your kids, and your kids go, "Dad, what's a harlot?" And the parent response typically is, "That's somebody who sells their kisses." And because we're kind of softening it up a little bit for our audience, that's important. I mean, we don't necessarily need to be discussing the intricacies of someone who has that level of immorality and that level of brokenness and what that term means in all applications, whether it is, economic harlotry or spiritual harlotry, whether they work in the temple, whether they work out of their own place of employment, if you want to be, thinking about it that way. I would suggest understanding those levels of learning and age appropriateness come to the process as well. In your case, you've got a kind of an interesting mix because you're teaching it sometimes at the college level. But what a lot of folks don't know is that at any college, and even at Florida College, the academic and spiritual background of your audience is not just bland, all the same. It's all over the place. So I was interested to kind of hear how you handle that particular caveat when you've got students who may come out of anywhere USA, and then you have homeschool preacher kids. Not to pick on homeschool preacher kids, but they're a cliche, so let's go ahead and throw it out there as a counterpoint.
Yeah, I mean, that
preacher kids
absolutely
get enough rough end as it is.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. I mean, I've this last class I taught. I always teach 2 Old Testament history introductions, which is basically all the history of the Old Testament, and I do the same thing in the New Testament in the spring. And I always ask first quiz is I ask about themselves. Who are you? What's your familiarity with the Bible, right? Like, what do you know about these sorts of things? And every year I have people who think they know it all, and people who've literally never cracked the spine of a Bible, and who don't know anything. I mean, they don't know Noah from Adam, right? And that makes it difficult. It's one of the most difficult courses I teach because they really don't know anything. And so you've got, on the one hand, these people who've really grown up learning the Bible, at least ostensibly, although I would suggest that age appropriateness, that discussion that you were talking about, you tell your 4-year-old, well, there's someone who sells the kisses. I have a lot of my college freshmen who come in thinking the same thing, and that is a problem. But what I try to do, it's a really big problem. The number of the stories that their parents and Bible class teachers have avoided when they were children and never come back around to is startlingly high. Sometimes especially for those preacher homeschooler kids. But anyway, so what I had to do is, and this really is going back to Ben Young's comment, is you had to decide how much content do they need? Not do they want. What is necessary to understand the story? The way I explain it at the first class is that I'm like a tour guide when you're in a foreign country and you've got 2 weeks to see it. We can't do everything. And sometimes I'm going to be in the bus being like, hey, look over there. That's Big Ben. You should definitely know these 2 things about it. We're not stopping because we're going somewhere else. But I'm just trying to give them the lay of the land in terms of content-wise. But they need that much content, I think, because otherwise the concepts won't matter. Grace and forgiveness and salvation don't mean anything if you don't understand how messed up the people are, right? God's call of Abraham isn't nearly so incredible if you don't understand what he does going down to Egypt in the very next verses, right? God's grace, people don't think it occurs in, the Old Testament or something, right? They don't realize that God makes Aaron his first priest after he's already built the golden calves, right? So you have to kind of paint these big pictures, but at the same time, you can stop every so often and get off that bus, right, the bus tour, and say, we're going to talk about this one thing that I'm pretty sure even you homeschool preacher kids who really think you know the Bible don't know. And it's normally something that I think is kind of exciting, something really cool, something that will make them realize, hey, there's actually a lot here that I don't know. And I'm looking forward to learning more about it. I even did that, with your son. So whether or not he was listening in Bible class or not, right, that was the argument. But I think hopefully even, your kid learned some stuff in that very basic, extremely survey level course. So that's
Well, I know that he learned a few things. He likes to hassle me now here and then. And one of the things I think is important, you should be an exciting teacher to the point where the students who are in your audience come away not only richly interested in the text, but excited to learn more than they already know. That's a bit of your personality, that's a bit of your process, and that's a bit of your plan. And so that should be an outcome. Our process with our kids was not to structure them as, here's the memory bank, memorize everything, facts, figures, forms, because that's not what we chose to do. We chose to do our very best to make them want to know, to want to know more, and to be comfortable with learning more than they already know. Really, we're trying really hard to say, we want you to want to love God's word, love God's law, and make it a lifetime thing rather than just, I got it, I'm good. I never need to go back to it again. Whether that plays out in their lives is our prayer. We pray that works well. So maybe that worked. Might be listening, wandering around the room, hearing half the conversation. We'll see how that goes.
One thing that goes along with that real quick. Or sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to identify that we have a couple things to jump into it in a second, but go ahead.
So this is real quick, and it's related to the who. You'd mentioned already, know who you are, and I think that's really important. I'm not going to be someone I'm not, and you always want to grow who you are, but at the same time, let your own style, your own strengths lead your teaching. And what I mean by that in terms of even what you deal with is you don't want to only teach the things that you're interested in, but you don't also want to avoid teaching the things that you're interested in, because if you're excited about it and you love it, your audience they get that, and that's fun for them as well. And so finding that balance as well. Sorry, I just wanted to throw that in with the who,
right?
Because I think that's related to that kind of question.
Yeah, and academically, spiritually, experientially, all of that, don't be more or less than you are. You are, and for lack of any better term, good enough. If you're not a doctorate held, professor at some highly valued university, it's okay. And if you are, that's okay too. Both of those things have great, tremendous value. They're just things, not even things. They're just abstract constructs. You can be equally
Everything's a construct.
And so it's not a big deal. So kind of work through it and say, what do I want to accomplish here? Let's stop being pretentious about it and just actually get to work. Chris brings up a great point that I think is really important too. We can identify this. Preaching and teaching in two phases. Simplify the complex, invigorate the simple. I think it's a great kind of point. Marshall Keeple used to use the phrase "boil it down." I love that concept that he has. A couple of poems about it in some of the sermons, and so we can really kind of see some value of kind of let's make this a workable thing, because some parts of the Bible, they need a lot more time to simmer in our lives to really have the weight that we need. Venue matters as part of the who. Academically, that's a venue. Congregationally, it's a venue. Auditorium class, Bible class. I do some studies at coffee shops. The when, is it worship or is it a true class? In a school, you're going to do things differently too. You're going to test your students regularly to see if they're retaining the knowledge, and you're going to get onto them if they don't. You can't really do the same in a congregation for a couple of very good reasons. Time, people have other parts of their lives where they're providing for their families, relationships, etc., expectations. Who else is there? And I think a real point to ask is, why is someone there? I think that's kind of the other end of the who side of thing is not everyone that's in Jared's classes wants to be there.
No, they do not. Sometimes not even me.
Yeah. You know, like he's like the third choice teacher for the subject, and they're like, oh, yeah, I really wish more
They
was
don't even
teaching
want to
this
take the
class.
subject for some of them, right? So
Yeah. Some of the kids, for all kinds of various reasons, they're not going to be happy about being there. So you can be a bad teacher for them, not acknowledging that they don't want to be there. Maybe they'll be there no matter what you're doing, independent of who you are. They love the Lord, and you're teaching in a congregational context, and anybody could be teaching, and they're thrilled to be there. But understand that too. That's not just a, oh, gravy situation. That's a privilege in both of those cases. To have someone who's forced to be there, that's a privilege. To have someone who just deeply desires to be there, that's another privilege. And so each of those things are something to be balanced in all of that. So, Jerry, we went a little longer in this part than I planned.
yeah.
That's totally fine. But I do want to talk about a couple other things before we close out. In the links there, and if someone really wants to, they can click the link for a thread that Jared and I both have kind of talked a little bit about, that Dr. Williams provided on his Twitter feed. If you're not following him, I encourage it. Like I said, I don't agree with every ounce of what he says. I do think he is an expert in the things that he writes. He's pretty good at it. And he provides some insight that's often different than mine, that is helpful in me understanding the text. I may not quote any of it, but I'll certainly profit from it. And that thread, he links together how Bible stories connect. And at least for me, that's really exciting, really valuable, really insightful. And so I want to kind of work through this Twitter feed just real quickly with a couple of quick comments from each of us. I don't know if you got to pull that up. Can you pull it up?
I do. I've got it pulled up.
I'm not going to share it on the screen, although I probably could. Require me to think that one through. But
that's your problem.
I have to think and do two things at the same time. These are all issues for me in my life. But watch this. I think I will be able to accomplish that task.
We're going to get fancy. Here we
second.
go.
There's a button that I got to push there.
I was going to say, did
See,
you
that
have your
requires me to
monster
do
this
this.
morning?
Well, yes.
See, there you go. Powered by mango juice monster, whatever garbage that is.
Yeah, it's beautiful is what that is. Beautiful. So I think it's this one. So
Nope.
I should be able to.
Nope.
Is it not sharing this one yet?
What? Oh, success. And the crowd goes wild.
Right. So, but now it doesn't want to do that, so that's weird. I need to pull back off of that. For some reason, it doesn't want to screen share
Just
the thing that I want it to do.
If anybody wants to know, you can travel to Israel for $556.40 one-way trip from JFK to, I guess, Ben Gurion.
You're trouble. What are we seeing right now?
I'm seeing just the share screen for Blue Jeans.
All right, so I got to do this.
Oh, success.
How about this?
Look at that. There we go.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, this is
all right.
Is
so this is the Thread Reader app doing it, and so we've got a couple of great factual tidbits here. And so Thread Reader just breaks down its clear thread in an easy reading way. If you want to know more about it, ask later. So what he does is he kind of sets some background stuff for us, and why Ruth fits in its location textually. If you didn't know, different manuscripts of the Old Testament reorder the books. Some of them, because of the nature of the communities they came out of, also include other books in other ways. Some of them we would consider pseudepigrapha. We might consider them apocrypha, depending on our terminology and our groups we want to use, but they'll lump them together. And so he goes through like, here's the two main placements you find for it. Most of us are familiar with it existing where it does, as a closeout to Judges. And so he kind of shows this. And I think this is a point that I wanted to bring out, and we can talk about this. He shows how Judges closes off. And I think that's a pretty important point. So walk us through, if you will, just real quickly, the last 4 chapters of Judges.
Yeah, so at the end of Judges, we've had this kind of introduction, which is kind of chapter 1, verse 1 through 3, verse 5. And then you get into the book of the Judges themselves, the cycle of the Judges, if you want to use that terminology, which is all about these, 6 major, 6 minor judges, depending on how you kind of move things around. And then you get this epilogue. And Judges is strange that you have a really true epilogue in this way, that they're not, these stories are not necessarily chronologically included. What they are is to summarize, to really focus on this kind of spiral down, this toilet drain, if you will, of wickedness, where by the end of the book of Judges, it's pretty clear that the Israelites are worse than the Canaanites. They were sent to drive out of the land. And the implication being, if they were sent to drive the Canaanites out of the land because they were wicked, what is God going to do to the Israelites now they're even worse than the Canaanites? And this epilogue is played out in these 2 different categories of stories that comes there at the end of the book, chapter 17 and 18, which talk about kind of this, if we want to use the kind of the terms of Bloch and other people, the kind of degradation of the family and then the degradation of the tribe. And they start out in these ways, but they're paired up. Both of these stories, these 2 pairs of stories, include a Levite and the city of Bethlehem. And both also go to or from Ephraim. Both of them end up with this very specific number of people, 600 people from a tribe that is weak and about to be wiped out. The first being Dan in chapter 18, where they leave because they're like, you know what, we can't beat the Philistines. We're sick of even trying. They're kicking our tails. We're leaving and going up to Laish, where they're weak and we can beat them. And the other, of course, is there's only 600 people left of the tribe of Benjamin after the civil war that we could read in chapter 20. And we think, well, okay, well, that's kind of some neat little connections, but maybe, I don't really believe in literary criticism or don't think that kind of intertextuality is really a thing. But then you realize, wait, this keeps going deeper. So in both of these stories, we have the introduction and then kind of this hammer stroke, what Peter Williams calls a leitmotif of there was no king in Israel. And then that's kind of how it ends, in this really horrible way, the darkest section, I think, of the Bible. And then you get to Ruth.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, you get these same things played out, but in a very different way. You get Bethlehem again, right? You have links to Levites. You have all these other things that are connecting with Ruth to the end of the book of Judges, and yet in some ways it's subverting what is going in on these cases. Because if the book of Judges is about the Israelites being worse than the Canaanites and being destroyed, then the book of Ruth is about a Canaanite, a Moabitess, right, being better than the Israelites and being saved. And whereas the end of the book of Judges is there's no king in Israel and every man does what's right in his own eyes, well, the book of Ruth is, where are we going to get a king for Israel? And these all these.
I think that's one of the points I want to highlight is that Williams is not so much writing about what you would think is just why does it belong there. He's also giving us insight into the intertextuality of these stories, how they relate to one another. He's giving you teaching tools to how to explain this and remember it. Because Chris mentioned a Bible study he was part of, maybe a sermon series about listening to Genesis as if you were on the bank of the river and Moses was talking. So we tend to remember stories because they have structure. Anybody I know who has been in the military, if I begin a statement to them and say this phrase, so there I was, they know exactly what's going to happen next. They know that there's something funny, hilarious, or awful, maybe the same thing, about to be described to them from the past. So they know that structure. Well, the Israelites had those structures too. They had conversational structures that took place. We can kind of look back and now see the work of God as he tells the story of God's people to us through inspired speakers who may or may not have actually even been there for some of these events, but they're given the insight that they have. He's using those same structures. Those structures then tie together the wonderment of everything's awful bad in the ravine that the Studebaker is submerged in the murk and the mire, and then he sends to the storytellers of God who are telling us what happened next. Here is redemption and rescue. Here is taking all of that awfulness, washing it up, and it matches so intimately with the story of Jesus because it's in the lineage of Jesus that these same people take these same steps. And the Israel that we find that Jesus walks into isn't really that much different. They're submerged in the Roman environment, subverted from their purpose and principle, and Jesus washes them, both physical Israel in some senses in his conversations, but Israel generally as a construct is washed. And so we get all of that. And if you don't catch Ephraim and Bethlehem as being biblically significant in all of those stories, well, he's bringing that back up to you. And so just kind of walking through text like that, and even small details that you probably will never put into a typical class about manuscript issues. Like here, we're talking about the Aleppo Codex, and as he refers to it as the greatest Hebrew Bible manuscript of all time.
Yep.
He talks about how this process of protecting the honor of Moses takes place, and some of the questions about that, and is it Moses, is it Manasseh, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he highlights this connection between the third generation of Moses, Ruth and Boaz, and where are they set, and how that impacts, toward the end of these things, how we see all of this story kind of being read into the interwoven testimony of God. I want to make a quick point, and then we'll have some opportunities to conclude a couple things. Seeing the literary style that God chooses to reveal something doesn't change the literalness of the backstory. It's not whether or not some of this stuff happened or didn't happen. What we're doing is we're learning the methodology that he's using to instruct us with so that we properly convey that. A parable is not a poem, is not prose, it is not just a factual paragraph. They're not the same thing, and they read differently, even though they may all have the same things going on. And for the American, just think about the Stars and Stripes and the Star-Spangled Banner. Those are literal things, literal poems about a literal event, but they all teach parts of it in different ways. And so if you can understand the Stars and Stripes, and you can understand the Star-Spangled Banner as being two different forms of historical expression that all relate to a real thing that really happened, that can easily connect to, say, Job. It can connect to these stories from Judges, from Ruth, from Esther, from Song of Solomon and Ecclesiastes, which is as much literalism as it is prose and wisdom literature. And so kind of seeing that stuff, I think, is just a really, at least in many senses, powerful way to grapple together the text. I just got to see if I can get this thing safely off of here without destroying the internets.
We all have hope.
So many different bumps. Yeah, well. And we can. I think it's gone. I just need to go to.
I believe.
Nope. They don't make it easy on me.
It's just because they don't like you in particular.
Button. Found it if I can get it to work. Okay, now it's doing more annotation.
Whiteboards? Fancy.
See, now it's treating it as it's an annotation now. So now I've got to get to what it's actually. So just. I know what to do, I think. Anyway, Jared, you can keep talking for a second while I figure out all these crazy stuff.
Sure. What do you want me to talk about?
Most certainly we got to start wrapping up the last part of putting all this together. If I look at the top of the thing, I can click the button right there.
Look,
Solve the
success.
problem. Yeah, solve the problem. Everyone's probably commenting and like, you guys are knuckleheads.
At least one of us.
You know, now, well, all of that's true. So now we're back to our regular screen. The screen's back to its normal setting. Couple things to add in on the close of this. We've been doing this with Terry. We'll close it off with this right now, especially when we get close to the end of the year. When we're considering encouraging younger preachers, Jared, if you could figure out one thing you wish you knew the first time you were full-time preaching that would be an encouraging thing to offer to you, given to you, what would that be? I don't know if you've caught some of the things in the past. I'll tell you quickly. I've talked
Yeah.
about taking a preacher aside and praying with him, Logos gift cards or giving him books, etc. Accordance gift cards if such a thing exists. But what will be a piece of encouragement? So if someone wanted to encourage a young preacher, what would you tell them to do?
I think the most important thing that I was told, and when I realized this, it made everything a lot better, is that not every sermon is going to be your best sermon ever. Not every sermon is going to be your best sermon ever. And that chasing the perfect can be the enemy of the good. And once you realize, not that you're going to accept it, not that you're okay with it, but once you realize that every so often you're just going to give a clunker. And that's going to happen. And that's okay. And once I realized I didn't have to be perfect, it made it a lot easier to be good. And I think that once I kind of took that pressure off myself, and once I had someone tell me that, it made everything a lot better. And again, that's of course not an excuse to sin still more so the grace may abound, but the recognition that you too are human, and no matter how good you are, sometimes it just doesn't work, and that is okay, was an enormous encouragement to me.
Yeah. A component to connect into that, you can preach the same sermon and someone could tell you that was the best sermon I've ever heard on that subject. No one ever preached it the best, better than that. And then in the same audience, someone can come to you and say, you're trash. They may not.
And they're probably both right.
And it's okay. We very often over respond to things. And this is something to think about. This is my comparative advice. College professors have office hours where students are allowed to visit to sit down and talk about things. They both like them and dislike them, for all kinds of great reasons. But I want to suggest something to someone. If you someone comes to you and says, hey, I didn't really get the sermon, or that sermon wasn't very good, be proactive in your response to it in this particular way is my encouragement or free offer to you. Is say something like, I'm glad to hear that you were carefully listening to it. Can we get together and have a specific time in play tomorrow at 2:00? Never today, but tomorrow or the next day. Can we get together over coffee, maybe in the morning before they and you both start your day, and have an intentional one-on-one conversation where the very start of it is you praise them for listening. Once you've done that, then you can take their criticism in a lot better way. It will be a much more effective conversation, even if in the end you feel like their criticism was not valid. But now you've moved the conversation in a healthier way. So they know, hey, yeah, I am available. And yeah, let's talk about this. And I'm speaking from the point of my own failure to do that in the past, but now that's my best practice going forward, is to not respond other than listen when it's first given. Even if they come to me right after the sermon, just listen and then say, let's talk about this. I still think if you're a listener, right after the sermon is the worst time to give positive or negative feedback that's substantial, that's like specific and critical. It's best given a day or two removed, but even so, let's kind of move it to a healthy spot. And Chris talks about how failure is awesome. We all learn by failure, and in fact, probably failure is our primary teacher. So that'd be my equivalent thing. A couple other structural things. The broadcast will continue through the year and we'll start up again in 2020 as well. At the same time, Terry will be part of the bulk of those broadcasts, as will I. We're going to continue to have guest speakers on who are experts in various things. We're going to be doing some stuff about logos and accordance and why those are good, and trying to do some better screen sharing than we did this time. And yes, you can get discount direct flights back and forth to Israel.
I know a guy.
You gotta have the right. I know a guy. But in the end, all of those things are connected to trying to figure out what the work of the evangelist is and how we can do it the best, how we can accomplish those great goals. Jared, academically, I know, and I'm going to put you on the spot here, that you are close to the completion of your dissertation. So once that dissertation is presented and defended, will it be available in any format for those of us who want to hurl tomatoes at it?
Yeah, I mean, nobody's going to read it, but I hear it should be thick enough to make like a good like table stand, maybe like prop up the window. I don't think it's going to be thick enough to stop a bullet. So I apologize for that. But for any of your other needs, it's probably pretty useful.
And what is the subject of your dissertation?
The problem with talking about dissertations is like two people know what they're about and only one of those people cares about them. But mine is about this earliest discussion by a Western person about the Jews. About 300 years before Christ, there's this guy who writes this really cool story about the Jews, and nobody really has agreed on what to do with it. And my argument is that he's actually doing something really cool. He's writing a utopia story, and just like sci-fi stories today, or zombie stories, right, dystopian stories, it's a critique of a society. And some of the things he critiques is pretty interesting and kind of eternally relevant. It's the earliest, for example, it's the earliest Western critique of infanticide. So stuff like that, pretty neat, very early, very different from a lot of the stuff that's going on in that period. So yeah, Robert, thanks. When are you going to be finishing with your dissertation? Peanut gallery over there.
Finished and defended. This is part of my point right here.
Yeah. Hopefully I will finish this coming semester. So I'm finishing up my part of writing this break. You're cutting into my time, so thank you for that, helping me procrastinate. But then it's just back and forth on edits, and hopefully we'll be walking this spring.
Excellent. We'll look forward to seeing that completion. We'll try to hassle you as need be to make sure you cross the finish line healthy, alive, and in good spirits. I want to thank everyone for participating, all your great questions and comments. If you got questions about the work of evangelist, stuff we can cover in these conversations, let us know. If you've got suggestions to make them better, go ahead and criticize away. We're content with that. Terry and I are both large enough personalities that we can take a few blows from time to time without even noticing that they happen. So it'll be okay. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.
Have a good one.
All right. So.